Hello everyone and welcome back to Little's Law YouTube channel, and today we are tackling another real world interview question that I guarantee you might have faced in your performance testing career, and if not you might be able to see it. So here is the scenario. So when I was recording a script with like 10 samplers, I mean again this is an interview question, so if you are recording a script with like 10 samplers and during recording everything worked perfectly and all 10 samplers passed, but now when you are revalidating the same script, the fourth flow is failing with an HTTP 400 error. And what could be the issue? So let me break down what we know. So the initial recording where we have all 10 samplers passed, and then I have got the revalidation where the fourth sampler is now failing with HTTP 400, and then I have got other samplers 1, 2, 3, and 5 through 10 are still working fine. So here the question is, what's causing this failure? And this is a very common scenario, so your answer will show whether you understand the fundamentals of performance testing or not. And let's dive in. So starting with the second slide where you have to understand the HTTP 400 error. So first thing first, let's understand what HTTP 400 actually means. HTTP 400 is called a bad request error, and here is what critical to understand. This error means the server cannot process the request due to client-side error. Let me emphasize this as well. So it's not a server error. Those would be 5xx errors, right? The server errors are 5xx errors, and it's not an authentication issue because the authentication would be 401 or 403 errors, and the problem is with your request. So something that you are sending and something in your request is malformed or invalid, or it's missing a required data. So the key insight here is the server is explicitly rejecting your request because it does not meet the expected format or requirements. So the server is basically saying, I can't process what you sent me because it's wrong. And that's what the server, or that's what the server is responding to you. So let's say the key to solve this problem is if the script worked during recording but fails during replay, that means something changed between those two executions. So let me show you the timeline. So during recording, the script captured the real-time server responses and everything was fresh, valid, and current. Then there is a time gap. So during this gap, the session might have got expired, the data could have got changed, the tokens could have got invalidated. So during replay, and now you're using a stale or a hard-coded value from the recording session. And this is where most performance testers go wrong. So they assume that because they recorded it correctly, it should work. It should just work. But the reality is that dynamic data does not stay valid forever. And let's do the root cause analysis. So this is what your manager or your team will ask you to do. So let me give you the most common cause of this problem. So this accounts for about 60% of all cases I have seen in my 20 years of experience. So the issue is session or token expiry. The fourth sampler likely depends on dynamic data from the previous sampler. And here's what happening. The session ID that you have captured during the recording could have been expired by this time, and your authentication token may no longer be valid, and the CSR of token could have been expired. So remember, these are often one-time use, right? And your cookie values are outdated. So the solution is you need to implement correlation. What does that mean? What does correlation mean? So you use a regular expression extractor or a JSON extractor to extract the session or token from earlier responses, and you have to pass the dynamic values to the fourth sampler, and you have to stop using any hard-coded values from the recording. And this is correlation 101, and it's absolutely essential for any performance testing script. And then the next part is the root cause 2, where we check for dynamic data dependency, the second most common cause, and this accounts for 25% of cases, which is for dynamic data dependency. And what does this mean? So the fourth flow might be using data that no longer exists in the system, and some of the examples are, it could be a user ID that was created in flows 1 to 3, might have been a temporary and was deleted, or a transaction ID from an earlier sampler is no longer valid, or it could be a product or a team which you're trying to access was deleted from the system after recording, or it could be a reference data which no longer exists in the database. So what's the solution for this? So the solution here is you have to parameterize your data. You have to use the CSV files or generate random data, and you have to create data setup in a preprocessor to ensure the data exists before you use it, and you have to use data that's guaranteed to exist in your test environment. And make sure you don't assume the data from recording time still exists, and always think about the data lifecycle. And moving on to the next slide, the root cause 3. So this could be another possible reason. So which is particularly common in REST API testing. And this accounts for 10% of cases because the issue could be your body, your request body or parameter malformed or incomplete. And some of the problems which includes you might be missing some required fields in your JSON or XML payload, or you might be using some incorrect data types where you're sending a string when the server expects a number, or you might be using some special characters which are not properly URL encoded, and you could be using some timestamp formats which are incorrect or outdated, and you could be also using mandatory headers which are missing from your request. So here is what you need to do. Open the view results tree in JMeter or replay log in LoadRunner. Compare the recorded request versus the replay request. Validate your JSON or XML syntax and make sure it is properly formatted. And check for proper URL encoding of special characters. And make sure all the required headers are present in your request. And this is basic troubleshooting, but you would be surprised how often people skip this step. Yeah. And then the next part is the fourth way of root causing, doing the root cause analysis, where you are going to check the sequence or the order dependencies. So the root cause number 4 is often overlooked, but accounts for about 5% of cases, which is the sequence or order dependencies. On what this means, the fourth sampler expects something specific to happen in samplers 1 to 3, which is not happening during replay, and there could be some of scenarios like that. So you have sampler 3 which creates a record where that sampler 4 is supposed to update, but the creation is failing silently, and you might be having a specific state transition that must occur before the sampler 4 can execute. And also you will be having a server side session state which is not properly established. And then we do have the rate limiting where you are running the test too fast compared to how you record it. So what are the solutions here? So you have to make sure that you are adding assertions in samplers 1 to 3 to verify they are actually successful, and make sure you are adding timers to mimic real user pacing and don't hammer the server, and check if the sampler 4 needs conditional execution based on previous results, and make sure you verify any prerequisites which are met before the sampler 4 runs, and always think about dependencies between your samplers. So these are the possible ways that we check for the issues. And now let me give you a systematic debugging approach that you can follow for every single time. So enable view results tree in JMeter or extended log in LoadRunner. Compare the request and view response between recording and replay, and check for the response from sampler 3 and verify it's actually successful and returning the expected data that sampler 4 needs. And inspect the request data in sampler 4 and look for hard-coded values. Are you sending dynamic data or any stale recorded values? And review the server responses carefully. HTTP 400 responses usually include an error message that tells you exactly what's wrong, so read it. And check your correlation, so identify all dynamic values that need to be extracted from earlier responses and passed to sampler 4. So this 5-step process will solve 95% of your 400 error problems. And moving on to the slide 9, where I personally felt this, where I will do this part like the for those who are using JMeter, some specific tools that you should use, which is starting from view results tree. So this is your best friend. It shows you the exact request and response data for each sampler, and you have got the debug sampler which shows you all the variables and their current values at any point in your test. And then you have got the debug post processor. So use this to check what variables were extracted after each sampler executes. And then the log viewer, where you can check the jmeter.log file for detailed error information that might not show up in the GUI. And the pro tip here is add a JSR223 sampler with log.info statements to print the variable values at each step. And this helps you see exactly what data is being passed around. So I'm sure that you use all these samplers to, or all these components to test in JMeter. And moving on to LoadRunner. So LoadRunner specific debugging In extended log, I enable the send messages and data returned options in my runtime settings, and this gives me a detailed information about what's being sent and received. And then I use the replay log where I review the detailed execution log in Vuegen, and this is where I will see the actual HTTP traffic. And then I'll use the snapshot where I compare the snapshots from recording versus replays, and this visual comparison can quickly show me what changed. And then I've got my runtime settings where I enable logon error to capture detailed information specifically when any failures occur. So the tip for you for load runner is use LR output message to log variable values right before the sampler 4 executes, and this helps you see what data we are working with. So finally, the interview answer where we started. So let's go back to the original question and craft the perfect interview answer for this. So the question was, the fourth sampler fails with a 400 error during revalidation. What's the issue? So the professional response for this is the HTTP 400 indicates a client error in the request, and since it worked during recording but fails now, so the most likely issue is that the fourth sampler is using dynamic data that has expired or changed. So then continue with your troubleshooting approach. First, I would check if sampler 4 depends on session tokens or IDs from previous samplers, and these often expire between the recording and replay. Secondly, I would verify that samplers 1 to 3 are executed successfully and return the expected data that sampler 4 needs. And third, I would use debugging tools to compare the actual request being sent during replay versus what was recorded. And fourth, I would check the 400 response body service, which usually returns specific error messages indicating what's wrong. And finally, I would implement proper correlation to extract and pass the dynamic values instead of using hard-coded recorded values. And this answer will show me that I have understood the problem and I have a systematic approach and I know how to fix it. So same applies to you as well, right? So let me quickly explain you with a real-time example. In fact, you can even use this example in the interview as well. So the sampler one, where the user logs in, the server returns a session ID ABC123, and in sampler two, the user browses the products, and this sampler uses the session ID. The third one, the user adds the item to the cart, still using the session ID, and the fourth one, where the user goes to checkout, the user session ID ABC123, and boom, you get a 400 error. So why does it fail? The session ID ABC123 was captured during recording, but it is now expired. So when you replay the script, sampler 4 is sending that old hard-coded session ID instead of the fresh one that was generated in sampler 1. So the fix is very simple. Add a regular expression extractor after sampler 1 to capture the session ID automatically or dynamically. Then use the variable dollar open braces session ID close braces in sample 4 instead of the hard-coded value ABC123. So this is correlation in action, and that's the difference that we make between the script that works and the script that fails. And finally, the quick takeaway for those who are watching. So never trust hard-coded values, always correlate dynamic data like session IDs, tokens, and if it looks dynamic, it probably is. And the takeaway 2, debug systematically. So don't guess, use your debugging tools to compare recording versus replay. The evidence is right there. And then the takeaway 3, read the error messages. So HTTP 400 response often tells you exactly what's wrong. Don't ignore them. The takeaway 4, verify the dependency. So make sure each sampler's prerequisites are met. Use assertions to validate success. And then the takeaway 5, test incrementally. So validate the samplers 1 to 3 work correctly before you start troubleshooting sampler 4. And my final tip, remember if it worked during recording, the script logic is correct. The issue is always about dynamic data handling during replay. So with that, I come to the end of this video. Until I meet you all in another interesting, informative interview question, it is bye-bye from Assistant Mugam and your favorite Little's Law YouTube channel. Take care and bye-bye.